Welcome, everyone. I'm so pleased to introduce my friend and colleague, Olivia Cosío of Sounds That Carry, a valued partner here at CMA. Olivia and her co-founder, Renata Rolfing, have been really instrumental in designing and implementing key initiatives with us in New York City, in Houston, and we're excited to continue this collaboration as we plan for our 2026 National Conference in Chicago next August. I'd also like to thank all of you for being here during a very, very busy National Chamber Music Month. We really appreciate your membership, your engagement, and I know that today is going to be a really special session. So, Olivia, passing it off to you.
Great. Hello, everyone. Let me share my screen and get things started that way. So excited to be here, and thank you all for being here. Can everyone see my screen? Great. Okay. So today we're going to be talking about creative placemaking with purpose. So first, we're going to talk about what even is creative placemaking. I know that's a term that has been, and I'm delighted by this, thrown around a lot right now. So we'll get aligned on, what that is. We'll look at a case study, talk a little bit about, CMA's recent work in creative placemaking, how to do this work yourself, whether you're an organization or you're wanting to do this as, a quartet or as an individual. And then, of course, how to measure this impact, which we know is really important right now, especially in an arts funding landscape and in a cultural landscape where we need to be really proving our impact and maybe proving our impact in new ways. So first things first, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Olivia Cosío. I am an arts educator, I am an arts researcher, and I'm an opera singer by training. And this is Renata Rolfing, my colleague who is unable to be here today, but we work together. We are the co-founders of Sounds That Carry Creative Impact Consultants. We partner with arts and culture organizations to help design and implement this kind of creative placemaking work. We've been really lucky and very excited to be working with CMA on a variety of projects and continuing to do so. My work is focused on how the arts can enhance educational outcomes for K-12 learners, but also adult learners. And I'm really interested in informal learning spaces. So in other words, how we can help advance learning in spaces that aren't typically used for learning. So like outside of the classroom, or maybe transform the classroom into something that feels a little bit more spontaneous and informal. Renata Rolfing is a music psychotherapist and an amazing pianist. And she is an associate professor of music psychology at Berklee College of Music. And so together, when we were both in the greater Boston area, we saw a natural synergy between my work in arts education, her work in arts and community well-being and arts and health. And we started a variety of creative placemaking projects before our friends and colleagues in the nonprofit arts and culture sector said, hey, we really like what you're doing. We really want to be doing stuff like that. Can we work together on this creative placemaking work? And so that's how we became Sounds That Carry. So what we do is we help nonprofit arts organizations build meaningful community connections, design impactful participatory programming. Sorry, I need to move my camera, that go beyond passive engagement. And we also help that ensure arts initiatives are accessible, relevant, and transformative. And why do we do it? The arts face funding challenges, I think more than funding challenges as well. I think ideological challenges right now, and they must evolve to stay relevant. Traditional outreach, and I'll talk about what that is today, but traditional outreach isn't enough anymore. Communities need deeper collaborative engagement. And we want to help organizations create programs that honor community strengths, so that they're not parachuting in, doing something for a community and saying, great, we came and played for you, but that it's actually generative and keeps people wanting to come back and keeps everyone, artists and community members, feeling connected. So what is creative placemaking? This is the NEA definition. So creative placemaking integrates arts, culture, and design activities into efforts that strengthen communities. Creative placemaking requires partnership across sectors, deeply engages the community, involves artists, designers, and culture bearers, and helps to advance local economic, physical, and/or social change, ultimately laying the groundwork for systems change. So I think that I'll go into the difference between like a traditional arts experience and a creative placemaking experience just in a second. But I think that what's really important to highlight is that creative placemaking has the goal of improving the well-being of all the participants. And of course, all music and arts has that goal, but it might not be explicitly stated. And it might not be as curious as a creative placemaking effort to understanding how to do that. So where does this happen? I put arrows here because often these are interchangeable and maybe in some cases all three are happening. But just to give you a sense of like where it might happen, parks, plazas, alleys, gardens, sidewalks, transit stops, right, can host murals, sculptures, and in our case as musicians, pop-up performances, QR codes that link to different sounds. And then there's institutional settings, which would be like accessible events at libraries, museums, music venues. And this can often be a partnership between cultural institutions and community organizations. So this might be, for example, a community music school partnering with an organization like CMA or partnering with a local opera house, right, to be able to facilitate a program that is at the intersection of their communities. And then, of course, virtual online galleries, maps, community spaces, asynchronous, music sharing. And these can either be standalone, which we certainly saw during the pandemic, and we were very grateful to have that standalone content, but it can also augment the in-person programming or be an accessible way for folks who can't be there due to location or ability to engage. So I don't mean to draw these two as a binary because there is overlap, but I do think it's important to talk about what creative placemaking is versus like a traditional arts experience. So a traditional arts experience, if I buy a ticket to go see a jazz concert, right? Like there is a promise to me that I will see a certain program. And if I don't see that program, I'm going to be disappointed. I'm going to be like, what happened to my program? I paid to see that. And so it's a transactional experience by nature, right? I go, I expect to see something, I watch, and I leave. The audience is often separate from the creators or curators. And again, this is not a bad thing. It's good that the audience member isn't disturbing, the soloist doing something really incredible on stage, but there is a separation. And it often happens in dedicated spaces where we would expect to see that. And the last thing, and this kind of goes back to the idea of the promise, it is product oriented. And again, this is not a bad thing. It just means that there is a stated promise that you will get a certain product from that experience. Now, creative placemaking uses the arts and culture, maybe the exact same arts and culture that you would have seen in that traditional arts experience to shape public spaces, right? Or improve the quality of life for residents in that area. So it will often involve residents, artists, local governments, planners, and businesses working together to make something happen. And it can, but doesn't have to, but it can happen in everyday places, or it could happen in a cultural institution, but feature sounds, memories, stories from everyday places in that community. It's place specific. That's also really important. You can't really go on a creative placemaking tour across the country and see the same thing in every city, because by definition, that would be more a traditional arts experience. The creative placemaking has to respond to the place that it's in, and it is process oriented. If you're hosting a creative placemaking experience, you don't necessarily know what's going to happen. I mean, maybe you have an agenda, you have some repertoire, but because people are creating as they go, everything's going to be different. So this is from the NEA. Former Chair Jackson, who was at the CMA conference in 2024, she was a huge advocate for the idea of artful lives. So I'll read some of these because they're really applicable to this work, but I also highlight this because I think everyone on this call doesn't need to be convinced of creative placemaking and why we do it, because that's why we're all here. But I think that in a time where we have to convince other people, I think it's really important to point to an institution like the NEA and say, look, the NEA has said this. They champion this. And even as the NEA is changing, and I understand that there's a lot that's happened since this text was written, it is still an institution we can lean on in this work and say this is championed by the NEA. So artful lives, the idea is that all people have the capacity to be creative, imaginative, and expressive on their own terms. Arts and cultural activity can happen in many kinds of places, not just museums and theaters, and our concept of that activity must be expansive. Art process can be as important and, in some cases, even more important than art product. And mind you, this is directly copied from their website. Artists, culture bearers, and designers have many kinds of relationships to the world and help us see things from different perspectives, ask questions, speak truth, and help us see what could be. The arts are intrinsically important, full stop. And this is, I think, the most important. The arts are most impactful when they do not happen in a bubble, in isolation, but in connection to other dimensions of our lives, communities, towns, and cities, at the intersections of other areas of policy. And sorry, thought I saw something crashing, and practice like health, education, community, and economic development, transportation, the environment, and more. So when we're thinking about creative placemaking, and I'm getting to the end of the why and the what, and we're going to start getting to examples in a bit. But if we're making the argument for really what it does, it encourages sustainability. And that's something I know that we're always thinking about as a music industry is how do we make this sustainable? And sustainable for your organization or for your practice could be how do we get people to keep caring about this? How do we get people to keep buying tickets? How do we get people to keep learning to play an instrument when it's becoming less and less accessible in the education system? So I like this UNESCO quote, thinking about culture bearers, right, as advancing sustainability. They say culture is the bedrock of sustainability. It shapes our identity, fosters cohesion, and ensures that development is human-centered. So Renata and I in our work think about three different types of sustainability, and we'll see how this played out in the case study I'm about to go through. But we think about intergenerational responsibility. So I don't know about you all, but some of my most meaningful intergenerational relationships happened because of music and are happening because of music. And now I'm, like speaking to and mentoring younger musicians. So I'm kind of in the middle now in some ways. And that's been a really beautiful way to keep me personally sustained and wanting to be part of this community. And I think at a time where the arts are going to be harder to be in with funding and uncertainty, I think it's really important that we bolster that intergenerational responsibility and sustainability to keep people engaged and interested. And that, of course, goes into social sustainability. So how can creativity strengthen ties not just between people, but also between organizations, right? How can we help each other during this time and make those connections? And then, of course, how can creative placemaking act as a tool for cultural preservation? So for, safeguarding and collecting stories that are at risk of erasure. And we're about to actually talk about what we did in Houston and how that relates. But the last thing I'll leave you with, in case again you're making the case for this and you want frameworks to bring with you to your meetings. This is the Connected Arts Learning Framework. This is a Wallace Foundation framework, and it's really at the heart of everything that Renata and I have done. And what it does, this is an arts education quote, but I think that there's a lot of overlap between arts education, arts and health, creative placemaking. But they believe that connected arts learning puts arts education within the context of culture and community, offering an expansive and equity-oriented vision of the purpose of arts education, both individual, to support both individual learning and community thriving. So again, coming back to this idea of it being place-specific, it being highly collaborative, and being process-oriented. Those, I think, are the three things that distinguish creative placemaking from these traditional arts experiences. So the next thing I'm really happy to talk about is Sounds of Houston. So before I even tell you what Sounds of Houston is, I'm going to kind of walk you through what CMA and Sounds That Carry and the Houston artists were thinking about. And maybe as I'm talking about these questions that we're thinking of, I want you to maybe think of what ideas, unless you already know what Sounds of Houston is, I might have you think to yourself of what you might have done if these questions were posed to you and you were in charge of a creative placemaking effort. So the guiding questions that we were thinking about at first, CMA wanted to connect meaningfully to not only CMA members at the CMA conference, but to Houston. What's happening on the ground, what is place specific, what music and cultural richness is happening in Houston, and who are the residents of Houston, and how can we interact with them, and how can our members interact with them and learn more about the place that they've just flown to or that they live in. And so our guiding questions were, how do we connect musicians and long-term residents of Houston? How can we create opportunities for both parties to feel valued and interact meaningfully? And what Houston-specific priorities can be addressed through this work? And so we were thinking about Houston priorities. Huge one, as we all know, is climate change, and as a result, climate migration, which is when folks have to leave because their house has either been destroyed by a storm or the place that they're living is not, it's no longer safe. And of course, we know that within climate change and climate migration, there are it's intersectional, right? Like this affects, people of color disproportionately, low-income people disproportionately. So within this issue, there's a lot in there. But we distilled it to, okay, climate change, climate migration. The folks we're talking to in Houston are really concerned about this, and this is a big news story. CMA's priorities were connecting CMA members more meaningfully to the conference location and its community members, and contributing to the larger arts ecosystem in Houston beyond the conference. So the central question in the middle of these two priorities for Renata and I was, how can creative placemaking amplify stories of climate change and climate migration in Houston? I want to note that we said amplify and not solve, because I think that it would be silly of us to think we could solve climate change through creative placemaking. But what we can do through creative placemaking is amplify the stories to get people to mobilize and care about these things happening in Houston. So the key considerations were how big, how many people do we want to be part of this, and how long, and how do we invite and connect to community members? Renata and I are not, Houstonians. So how do we find these people? And is that going to be an accessible experience for the people that we find? How do we make sure it works for them? And then, of course, the big question is, what are we going to do? And what's the final product? So if you have an idea in your head, would love to hear in the chat, but I'm going to now take you through what happened. So the project was for Houston artists. So it was a smaller scope, and I'll go into why in a second. It was for Houston artists that partnered with resident narrators impacted by climate migration to document, record, and compose personal sonic narratives that reflect the residents' connection to memory and place. So in other words, these four Houston artists found neighbors, people from their church, community members, longtime friends that they had relationships with, and they interviewed them, and then they co-composed a musical a piece to kind of accompany and weave through it, and it created a sonic memoir. So a sonic memoir is layered sound compositions that blend the narrator's voices, environmental sounds, and music. And the reason that we are calling it a sonic memoir and not just a musical piece is that it's creating a living archive of sound and storytelling. And the reason that it was only four Houston artists and we didn't want to make this a huge effort is we really believe in the power of depth over breadth, like people really connecting and really doing something for many months and building that relationship, and then using that and using the product created to help other people understand issues in Houston. So you're about to hear a short clip from Chelsea D'Souza, who interviewed her friend. Her friend is a contractor. And he had a very interesting relationship to climate change and migration, because he said, wow, I'm seeing the devastation and it's incredibly sad. And simultaneously, my business is booming because all I'm doing is repairing roofs all day. And so when we first talked to her, she said, I know exactly who I'm going to ask. I'm going to ask my friend Jamie Alvarado. These are the rest of the fabulous artists that participated, but we're now going to hear Chelsea D'Souza's. Oh, here we go.
And they just want to talk about their experience. Sitting down with them and explaining it to them in a way that they can really understand it, just bringing comfort to the homeowners, whether it be through a storm or just to, they wanted something done, whether their house painted or a renovation to their house, I like it. And I like the fact that when I'm done, they're happy with things. And it does. I feel like I'm doing what I was meant to.
So that's just a short clip, but we can see already that this is a bi-directional relationship. The narrator shares, reflects, and presents, and the artist witnesses, documents, and augments it through music, and of course through their own questioning and the things that they are curious about that maybe the narrator wouldn't have thought to talk about. And together, that is a creative collaboration. And so what did everyone get out of it? And we are going to get to hear another one because they're Gorgeous. What did everyone get out of it? The narrators engaged in a creative experience. They had ownership of the creative product and the story. They built intergenerational relationships, and they received compensation. This is important. The artists used their musical experience in new ways. They developed skills in editing, interviewing, and composing, and they received compensation. And CMA made connections to new local artists and narrators, generated interest in creative placemaking among CMA members, and helped secure donations to climate relief efforts during Sounds of Houston presentation at the conference. So at the end of the presentation, we had QR codes ready, we had action ready, so that folks could not just listen to this and feel sad, but actually do something, which is great. Sorry. So we're now about to hear one more, just so you can hear how different they all are. And this is just to kind of tie up the listening, but I will provide you with a link where you can listen to more.
So yes, the weather have really put a big impact in my life. Even when I was a little kid, I can remember Hurricane Alicia, and I was a little kid in elementary then. I mean, everything was shut down. We didn't have power then. I mean, for us to be in 2025, I don't see how we can't keep power. We need time to be caught up with time. We need time to be caught up with, and they sending people to space.
Okay. So the other thing we wanted to understand was not just whether people enjoyed listening to them or whether the narrators and the artists learned anything about each other or themselves through this. We actually wanted to understand what this did to the people at the CMA conference listening to these sonic memoirs. So we were curious if this did anything to people. I think that we always say, the arts help with empathy, the arts help connect us, and we wanted to know for sure if that was happening. So we designed a survey. And so we wanted to understand these 4 pillars. We wanted to understand if sonic memoirs evoked empathy toward the narrators and their experiences. And we wanted to explore how specific sonic elements contributed to emotional connection. So was it the sound of the piano? Was it the sound of the narrator's voice? Was it the sound of the rain, right? We wanted to understand if this shifted the listener's perceptions of climate migration and its human impact. And we wanted to examine how storytelling fosters a deeper appreciation for the intersection of environmental and cultural narratives. We wanted to understand if listening experiences fostered community solidarity and understanding. And then lastly, we wanted to understand if this actually inspired individual and collective action on climate justice. And we wanted to assess whether the experience led to tangible behavior changes or activism. And we're still in the process of understanding this, by the way. So we collected a lot of data, but here's one that I think is particularly interesting for creative placemaking. So we surveyed 58 listeners during and after the CMA conference, and we did a pre and post survey. It validated that personal storytelling, music, and sound was a highly effective communication tool. So in the pre-survey, 45.16% cited personal stories as their preferred way to learn about climate change before listening, but 74.19% cited personal stories after listening, and that they felt more inspired to contribute to climate justice after listening. So why is this important? Not because we're trying to shift anyone away from science. We need science and we need to trust data. But a lot of people don't understand how this might impact them or people like them until they hear about how the rain dripped through someone's roof and they could hear that and they could hear the human impact of that. So we want this to augment climate efforts, not to replace them, right? I think that that's a key tenet of creative placemaking, is that it's meant to shed light on, it's meant to support, not to solve on its own. So how do we design something like this? And how do you design something like this? If you're, maybe you've already designed something like this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the chat, or maybe you have never done it. I hope that there's something useful for everyone in this next little piece. The first thing that we need to do is we need to identify the community. So what I would love everyone to do, if you happen to have paper and pen near you, or you're on your phone, or maybe you're just kind of an internal processor, I would love to take 2 to 3 minutes, and I would love everyone to think about a community that you would like to facilitate for. So maybe it could be a city community. Maybe you can start big. It could be a particular community organization that you're connected to. It could be a school. But I want you to get clear on the community that you want to facilitate for. And then I want you to think about the intersections that you have with this particular community. Maybe you're from there, maybe you're super not. And it's important to know that. And this is really important. Why are you the person or organization to facilitate this project? And I don't mean for this to sound like, who are you then? I mean this to say everyone has something to bring. So what are you going to bring and offer to this particular community? So take 2 to 3 minutes. And if you have ideas, you could put them in the chat, of course. And as you come up with ideas, I would love to hear in the chat, if you're comfortable, you don't have to, the community that you'd like to facilitate for. Like, who came to mind? Hometown. Where is that, Marie? Nice. Okay. So for the sake of time, oh, fabulous. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. So I want you to keep these questions in your mind. I'll move forward. Step 2 is building and maintaining the connection. So now I want you to think for a second, who am I already connected to in this community? And how can I speak with them about their community's priorities? Now, if not connected at all, you should identify long-standing local organizations with whom you'd like to know, and do research on what priorities might be and be ready to hear their ideas. Another thing you might consider is not just organizations, but friends, family, people you know who are from there. That lived experience is really valuable data. So just think for a minute or two now, who are you connected to and how are you going to talk to them? If you're not connected, who are you going to try to connect with first? anyone came up with like a great local org or something that they thought of miraculously in the last minute. I welcome that. Although, right, oh, veterans, fabulous. As a community, yeah. Right. Okay, so just still thinking. Now, the third thing, this is something that you can't really do independently. I mean, there's some stuff you can answer independently, but also I love cultural and language centers. Absolutely. Yes. Yes, for sure. I also think like if you're stuck, schools are such a good place to start because schools can just be like these community hubs. They know what's going on. They know the YMCA. They know the Boys and Girls Club. They know everyone. They know the food pantry, right? Try to get connected to the hubs. And most times people will love if you're like, I'm an artist, I want to do something. We're like, great. Our music program got cut. Come in. So it really can be that simple. It doesn't necessarily need to be, but it can be. Fabulous. In the chat. Okay, so then once you reach out to these folks and you have a meeting, you want to ask them, what are your community's current priorities? The word priorities to me, for me personally, I welcome anyone to disagree with this and I would love to hear what people are using. I like priorities rather than needs because I think that if we come in being like, what do you need, right? We might not be able to offer that, right? Like I'm an opera singer by training. I can't really help with Medicaid, right? I would love to be able to do that, but I can maybe do something to help folks who are at risk of losing it, right? Like an arts and health intervention. So priorities I really like as a word. And yeah, totally an assumption that they're in need, right? Like maybe they're not. A lot of the time they're not, right? So then another question is, can you think of any ways that the arts have or could address these priorities? And then you want to be really clear, I think, before you go in and say, I can offer this, or my organization has 4 musicians working in a community engagement department, or I'm a saxophonist, I can do that. Like, be clear on what you can offer, or I'm a really good grant writer. I've written a lot of grants, right? Does that spark any ideas for how we might work together to create something? And then this one is a really important one, I think, especially right now, because of course, what's really important is that there needs to be funding for this. A lot of the time there's materials, there's fees, right? So if neither party has money to spend on it, you could say, hey, I'm going to apply for some grants. Here are 3 grants that I found. Would you be willing to write with me? Could we co-write something? And if we get the grant, we'll go for it. We'll do it. And if we don't get the grant, no pressure. You know, I'll come volunteer once a week anyway. So that's a way that people are like, how do you fund this? And I think right now it's going to be a lot of number 4. So now step 4 is allocating or finding funding, right to the right to the big question that everyone has. So the big question is, does my organization already have funding allocated for this? Do we have a community education department? Do we have a school visit that we already do? Or, very important, do we have a board member or a donor who really likes this work that we might propose to and be like, hey, would you give X amount for this thing? And now, if not, would my partner be willing to apply for grants with me? If not, or if you don't get the grant, how much of this could be volunteer-led or low cost, right? I think an all or nothing thing can be quite dangerous. And then the fourth point is, if my organization has funding for something else, how can I still integrate what I learned from this meeting into that? So if we do have funding for a chamber music series, right? And I learned, for instance, that I don't know, like a lot of people who want to come to the music events, the bus stops running at a certain time. And so they can't come because the one bus that gets them there will already have left by the time the chamber music event has ended. Then maybe if I have funding to do the chamber music event, it'll be an hour earlier. Try it out, right? So there's ways to integrate this knowledge into the ecosystem of your arts organization, even if it's not the exact thing. And what does that do? It does 2 things. It helps say to the person of the organization, hey, I'm listening to you. And I know that arts funding is really hard right now, but I'm trying to do something and I'm trying to help. And then the second thing is it might shift the culture of the organization or of your quartet or your practice to be more responsive and to not see this as an add-on or in a silo, but a constant process of collaborating with the community. So now what's super important is not just doing this work, but as I said at the beginning, we have to be able to prove it works because a lot of people don't believe this works. A lot of people might say, why would we do 4 Sonic memoirs rather than a concert with 300 people? Valid arguments for sure. Like I understand, like there's a lot to be argued there. But I think that it's hard to make the argument without the data. But because we have the data, I can say, well, 71% of participants said that they were moved to donate to climate migration because of what we did, right? So we're able to back it up in numbers when we can't back it up with story and personal history. So we'll talk a little bit about how to measure impact regardless of the scale. I think that the first step is moving beyond butts in seats. Sorry to say kind of a cross term, but I think that it's very common and understandable to say we sold 700 tickets to this thing. It matters, it's important, we need to know that. But I think that there's also a variety of other questions that we need to ask about our efforts that will help the case, especially for grant writing, to be honest, and for making pitches to potential donors and people who are interested in this work, and to also be able to present that back to the organization and say, hey, look what the kids are saying about the work we did together that we created. So you need to know, what do you want to know? How will you know it? And how are you going to use this data to get what you want from stakeholders? Essentially right now, because we all gotta have funding. And so the what do you want to know, I'm going to talk for a little bit about effective questions and how to ask an effective question. So effective questions are complex, distinct, and unbiased. So they go beyond yes or no, they focus exactly on what you want to change, and they can be answered by evidence. So I'll talk about what a biased question is. They're kind of hard to spot. But first, I think it's important to have smaller questions. So for example, if the big question is how can our organization increase engagement, that can't really be answered with data. It's really big. So I would maybe think of 3 smaller questions and say, are audience members more likely to buy tickets if they have attended one of our free community concerts? Technically, that's yes or no. I just broke my own rule, but it's a smaller question within a big question. 2, what factors influence a concert goer's decision to attend our events? So is it the cost, the content, the membership? Which identities are most and least represented at our events? What have we done to specifically engage with those communities in the past? I think very often the word community is used kind of in a coded way, like the community is someone who's like not typically at your event, but technically, there's a CMA community, there's a CMA membership community, right? There's a school community, there's all sorts of communities. So it's really important to identify which sub-communities are involved and not. So here's an example of a less effective question and how I would transform it into a more effective question. So less effective would be, how can we drive ticket sales? It's really big, really broad. Now, more effective would be, what suggestions do our audience members have to improve our offerings, right? Because then maybe they'll buy ticket sales. Instead of, why did less families attend our family day this year? It doesn't focus enough on the change. I mean, it does, but it's like really broad again. We would say, which aspects of our programming appeal to families with children under 12 years old, and what barriers might be in place? Because if we ask an open-ended question and say, why didn't you attend? We're not going to get the answers we need. But if we do say, hey, people who attended last year, what was the most exciting part of what we did? Then we can replicate it. Or maybe I did a family day event once 3 years ago that didn't have stroller parking and it wasn't wheelchair accessible. Huge barriers, right? Had to change that. Saw 400 new visitors the next year. So here's an example of a biased question. So did social media ads drive younger people to attend? It's sneaky, but the bias in there is that younger people use social media, right? So it's a yes or no answer, and it already has a bias, although it's tricky to spot. So a more effective question would be, does increasing the number of social media ads increase ticket sales? And if so, for which age groups? Because maybe there's a whole other age group that you wouldn't have tested if you only assumed that young people were driven by that. So now I want you all to think of your big question for your organization or your solo practice even. And then maybe think of 1 or 2 small questions that might accompany it. And I'm actually going to put this up as a frame of reference as you think. And you can put it in the chat. You don't want to share your small questions. I would be very curious what big questions are coming up for everyone's organizations right now. Give everyone about 30 more seconds and then you can sit with your questions or you can share. Either are okay. Great question. I'm seeing in the chat how to compose a piece that engages the largest amount of people possible. Yeah. So some questions I'm already thinking of in there is like, what is engagement? Yeah, what does engagement look like? Cool. So for the sake of time, I will move on, and I am very curious about the big and small questions, and feel free to share or just take it with you. But I do want to just wrap up and talk about how you will find out the answer to these questions, because these questions are what drive effective storytelling for your organization and for your personal practice. So pretty easy and free. You know, surveys, Google Forms is great. Focus groups, if you're able to connect with an organization that has people willing to meet with you. Of course, also you can analyze existing data. Your organization has so much data, maybe in unexpected ways. Maybe you're new to an organization, you need to dig through it. And then interviews as well. And how do you present this to stakeholders? So quantitative, meaning numbers, and qualitative, meaning quotes, testimonials, is a stronger case. So funders typically want to know who you're reaching, how deeply they're engaging, and the change that you're creating. So if your questions can focus around demographics, engagement, and the outcomes, not just outputs, that's going to position you really well to do this kind of work in the future. Three last things before wrapping up and doing a Q&A is thinking about engagement depth. So not just, for example, people who came to the event, but figuring out a way to ask them what they felt during the event. Thinking about diversity and reach, so like new versus returning attendees, being able to distinguish between that, and maybe geographic data, even like seeing, you know, the zip codes that tend to come to your events if you're a place-based organization. And then the community impact, of course, this would be like quotes from partners, the relationships built, the social impact from the folks that you worked with. This really makes the case as well. And I think that any kind of video, audio that you can collect is that qualitative piece that often seals the deal when you are making the case for this work. So that is it from me. I would love to take questions or just hear what anyone is thinking about at their own organization or practice. And that's all from me for now.
Thank you so much, Olivia. It's so great watching this. I really enjoyed it. It's
Thanks.
awesome.
Thanks.
Yeah, let's see. Anybody have a question?
Or a thought. It could be a thought as well.
That is true. I used your questions for a project that kind of got ruined by 2020 when I was back at the Tucson Symphony. And I was trying to figure out what the big question is. It's since there was such a diverse Hispanic population, you know, from different areas and from whether they're first or fifth generation refugees, things along those lines. I was working for the symphony, and it was like, okay, we want to provide programming. We have a mobile stage. We can do all of these things. But in terms of the actually making meaningful engagement rather than I am coming to you and I am blah, blah, blah. I think there's just thinking about like, what are the ways that you engage that diverse of a Hispanic population in an area?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a huge question, I think, for so many cultural orgs is like, there's folks around us who we would like to be more represented, but how do we do this in an effective way? So yeah. Elena. Or Elena, I'm sorry, how do you pronounce your name?
Hi, Elena. Yes. So I was just wondering, how did you learn how to make your case with stakeholders? What do you find was the best way for you to speak with stakeholders, basically? Was it through trial and error, or was it through learning from your peers, or a mix of different methods?
Mm-hmm. I think the biggest thing is trying to do as much research on the stakeholder as I can before and understand what their pain points might be. For instance, there are going to be stakeholders who are really down for this work and you don't need to convince them. They're just curious about what's happening. And then there are stakeholders who really think that a school visit should go one way. And you have to be able to point to previous work. The hardest thing, honestly, was getting that previous work to point to. So Renata and I, before we became Sounds That Carry, piloted stuff for free. We were just doing projects around Boston because we wanted to basically prove what we were doing worked. And that, of course, that's not everyone can do that, and not everyone can do that at certain times in their life. But I think if you even know anyone doing this work who might help you with data, to provide a case study, that is often really helpful because creative placemaking tends to be a little more nebulous. So you can't really say, okay, 400 people came to this. So you do have to kind of maybe show people the impact, like play them a clip before you even talk to them about it, because the context is important. So I think, just to distill what I just said, I think case studies, if you have them, and it doesn't have to be yours. The NEA website, if you search NEA creative placemaking, has a ton of case studies that you can draw from, and that's a trusted resource. So you could point people to those. You could present your own idea and how those intersect with things that have been proven to work by the NEA or by yourself or a similar organization. And then the most important thing is, when you do the thing, collect a lot of data that you can use for different things, for different stakeholders. Maybe a stakeholder wants to know what repertoire you did and why kids liked it. Maybe another stakeholder really only cares about the economic impact, right? Like, how many people came for free or something like that. So just being able to collect as much as possible.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
I was kind of interested, was it Rima, just hearing about your experiences, out in rural Montana. It would be very interesting to hear.
Oops, sorry. Trying to turn my camera on. I'm having issues. Um, Thanks, Julia. Yeah, we're located in rural Montana, and I would say my question is almost the opposite from perhaps everyone else's because we're fully funded by our founders. So we would be consulting with ourselves as far as like, funders or stakeholders in that regard. But the audience that comes to us in rural Montana sometimes wants more, 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 and we can only give a certain amount. So our concerts sell out pretty quickly. There's a drawing to get tickets to our concerts in the chamber music series that we present, which is 5 weeks long. And so my question would be, how to engage the community to explain, we're so sorry, but this is all we can give, and we want to include you in this. So it's kind of like an opposite issue.
Oh my gosh, I love to hear that that is an issue. I love to hear that there's a drawing to go to a chamber music festival. That's amazing. And congrats on that. That's huge. It's amazing. Um, I think kind of helping them be self-sufficient and connect with each other. So maybe it's like a coffee hour where you can meet all the other people in your area who love music, and you can maybe facilitate a like help them kind of lead it themselves without your organization having to lead it, but then maybe checkpoints. So maybe saying like, hey, we're going to do a Facebook group, and if you want to connect with other people at this concert, join the Facebook group or whatever people are connecting on Instagram or something. And maybe it could be also like, you could encourage, maybe make a, what is the word for that? Like I'm seeking or I'm giving kind of like board. I'm thinking about the iLab at Harvard has a big kind of chalkboard when you enter, and one of them is post-its that says like I want to give someone my coding expertise. I want to practice that. And then the other side is like I'm looking for someone with coding expertise because I have an app. So maybe something structurally, either online or at the site, that helps people connect with each other. Like I'm looking for a violinist. I'm an amateur violinist. And then someone saying like, I'm looking to join a quartet, and then maybe connect them so that you're not responsible. Maybe this is already happening in a beautiful way, and I'm suggesting something that's like already happening, but that's just my first instinct.
No, I really appreciate that, Olivia. We do have relationships because, when you're in a rural environment, everyone knows everyone really well.
Yeah.
And so we definitely have repeat folks that we've developed strong relationships with over time. But I love all of your ideas because it's just a different mindset in engaging someone when we're already maxed out with the programming that we can provide.
Yeah. And of course, like virtual also, I'm sure, do you do virtual stuff? And it's like that's such a great question. That's such a great problem to have. That's wonderful.
Yeah, we're really fortunate to have that challenge. And then, Julia, I don't know if your question was specifically about presenting chamber music in rural America, but we find that, people who have money to go to large cities can go to New York and they can go to a concert at Lincoln Center, or they can visit larger cities with many arts possibilities. But some folks in rural America don't have time or money to travel to a large city. And so it's really great to bring things that are usually in a higher densely populated area to a place where it's not available very often. And just by that nature, these concerts become very popular. And that was a surprise for Tibbet Rise when it was first created.
Really.
Thanks. That was interesting to hear about. I see that, Anne, that you unmuted. Did you have something you wanted to say?
I did, and great to see everybody here. And Kevin, thank you for presenting this program, and Olivia, thank you for sharing your work. So I'm the CEO of Creative Placemaking Communities. I don't know if y'all have heard of us, but we do professional development in the field. And one of the things I wanted to say is it's a challenge with music, because I'm a musician, I'm a flutist, and really trying to figure out how to connect those dots. And so my suggestion would be thinking out of the box in untraditional ways to bring music to place, to community. One of the things that we did at our conference in Atlanta was an activation in Krog Street Tunnel with the Spelman Glee Club singing a cappella. And it was an incredible cultural moment for Atlanta, but it also got a lot of press. And so remember that those kind of things also have impact, even though it may not be audience. And also thinking about different ways that you can connect with different types of community engagement. So when for example, when we did that event, we worked really closely with the Cabbagetown neighborhood, which really that spot in Krog Tunnel was like a sanctuary, and they never let anybody do anything in there. And so it took several months of conversation with them, and really trying to understand what they're trying to do in that community in terms of supporting the arts and making sure that we were in partnership with that. So I just encourage everybody to think out of the box and think of untraditional ways that you can partner with communities, other musicians, using activation as a key way to spread your music. That's all I wanted to say, but thank you for this.
Absolutely. You're here. Absolutely. I know we're at time, so I want to pass it to Jenny or Julia or Kevin. Hot potato.
Yes. Thank you all for being here today. I know a few people had to leave. What I really enjoy is how thought-provoking this program was today. So thank you, Olivia. I think it gives all of us something to walk away with and ponder for quite some time, and hopefully with some of my work here at CMA. So next week we actually have a panel that we're really excited about. Kevin is leading a panel of leaders in the arts to talk about, what's going on in the chamber music field. What does the next year really look like? Or what's the pie in the sky thing that we want to believe that chamber music can do? And that will be with Kevin, of course, Oscar Espino Ruiz of Music Mountain Festival, and Drew Tucker of South Arts Foundation, and Marna Seltzer of Princeton University Concerts. So it'll be an interesting conversation, and that's just the first of many. So there's a lot of perspectives on this, of course. So we have more exciting things coming up in June, which we'll be in touch about soon. And I just really appreciate having this chance to connect with members and hear your thoughts and where you're from. So thank you so much for being here today.